Welcome to the binary episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. In this episode, we have a Talos report in Hancom Office 2020, a boot ROM bug in NXP High Assurance Boot, and a discussion around old vulnerabilities. But before we get into any of that, we'll cover the Spot the Vuln solution for the week, and I'll pass that to Z.
Yeah, so this week's Spot the Vuln, if you looked at this last week, should look fairly familiar. Major difference is last week with this validate cookie function on line 8, we had that secret that wasn't really a secret. This week, I modified that. Basically, I just patched in a function saying get secure secret. You can imagine that's, one, it actually has a semicolon at the end so the code compiles and runs. But two, that it securely gets a secret. I'm not going to go into actually generating or how that might be done. But this is one of those cases where, there was a blatant issue, but there was also a deeper issue with how this was being done beyond just the secret not actually being secret, which did actually get called out in our Discord last week. But I didn't see it get brought up either in Twitch chat or some of the other places I post this. And so that comes down to in comparing this cookie. So again, for the listeners who don't know or who can't read what the code is, it's basically starting off, cookie comes in from the user, it splits that out and splits that by a pipe delineated string with a username, an expiration time, and an HMAC. Presumably the server at some point is generating the secure cookie and passing it out, and then they can replay that as like their session token in a sense, or authenticate them that way somehow. So it pulls out the username expiration there, checks the expiration time, just make sure it hasn't already expired. And then it computes what the HMAC should be using its known secret that in theory nobody should know or be able to compute. Calculates an HMAC using that secret over the username, and the expiration is just appended directly to it. Key problem there isn't how that HMAC is actually computed. When it's doing the split, or at least the thing that stands out to me to notice the issue here, is when it does the split, the original token has the delineation there. It's using those pipe characters, username pipe, expiration pipe, and HMAC. And in this case, when they're actually calculating the HMAC isn't based on username pipe expiration. It's based on username expiration. Those two are together. There's no delineation between the two, which means data from the username might be interpretable as part of the expiration. Or vice versa, a number from the expiration might come in as part of the username. Like, there's no delineation there. Therefore, you can kind of have a bit of a data confusion when saying, like, yeah, okay, this hash is correct, but was it actually what was intended? So the example case for an attack against this one might be if you want to get access to the admin account or have a cookie that was valid for the admin account, you could take a account, or you could register an account, say admin1, and then server at some point is going to generate a cookie admin1, and then create like an expiration date. Let's just say 1,000 for it, which is definitely expired at this point, but roll with it. It gives it an expiration of 1,000, and then it calculates the hash, or the HMAC, sorry, as being admin 11000. Because that's admin 1 and then 1000 for the 1,000 altogether, which means that would also match if I edited my cookie after getting that one. If I just move that pipe character over one, whereas before it was admin 1 pipe 1000, if I move that pipe to admin pipe 1100, that would give me a late expiration date. That is not an expiration date somewhere in the past, and it would be valid for that admin username. It is a little bit tricky to explain over audio. I apologize for that, but the core issue is really just not maintaining the delineation when calculating the HMAC, allowing for a sort of confusion to happen. If somebody can inject that, they'll be misinterpreted. So yeah, I mean, it is a fun issue to be aware of. I've seen it with crypto before. It happens. People just aren't really aware of the purpose of having some sort of delineator if they think they can separate it on their own or whatever. Yeah, on a whole, I mean, it's just something to be aware of. Not the most common issue, at least I haven't seen it a ton these days, but it has been out there.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is it's an interesting bug, but it's probably not something you're gonna encounter too often. Which is maybe why this one, you said you didn't see it like mentioned anywhere that you posted or in the Twitch chat, and yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think of this right away either. It's kind of you have to be kind of thinking about how the string is being used and how you could mess with that to break the check. So yeah, it's a cool challenge. All right, so we'll get into our first topic here, which is a Talos report on Hancom Office 2020 Hword. Hancom Office is similar to like Microsoft Office, but it's a different suite. Formerly, it was Think Free Office. According to Talos, it's popular in South Korea. But yeah, Z, I'll pass the ball off to you.
Yeah, I think the only time I've heard of Hancom before was actually Talos reporting other vulnerabilities, so that's all I know about it is insecurities. At least I believe that's the case. It could have been another name. It's not a piece of software I'm super familiar with. But the issue here is fairly straightforward. Effectively, it comes down to as it's part. So it tries to support like docx formats, being an Office thing. It tries to support Microsoft Office file formats, and so in doing so, docx has some XML within it. So it's trying to parse XML, and in kind of a classic parser style issue, what it ends up doing here is it'll track like as it's parsing. If it gets a star tag, it's going to track the pointer to that. When it gets the end tag, it's going to try and reference the pointer to the star tag. The problem being, if it gets an end tag but it didn't have a start tag, at least for the WT, I'm assuming that's some sort of paragraph tag. It basically just won't. It won't check to make sure it received the start. It'll just assume it has a start pointer, backtrack a little bit in memory, when like jumps 4 bytes back or whatever, grabs the address there, and then calls a function based off of that offset to that. Um, so effectively, you've got somebody who had some sort of memory control. Some heap grooming is what they call out here. You know, heap groom something into place, could gain control over that pointer and effectively get an arbitrary call. Just because it's not checking whether or not there actually is a pointer where it expects there to be a pointer. It's just kind of a case of running through or a parser assuming the file is not malformed.
Which is something that seems to be really common in XML parsers for some reason. I feel like we've covered a lot of XML parser bugs on the podcast that have to do with like not having a matching opening tag or having an incomplete tag or something like that. Seems to
Yeah,
be a
I
fairly
mean,
common problem.
XML parsers tend to just be a little bit more complex, I think, on the whole, than say like a JSON parser. Um, you've seen kind of similar things with like a JSON parser, but you know, because XML has like this concept of tags and nested tags, there's just a lot more things that can go wrong, a lot more edge cases to be aware of. That just makes their whole state more complex. In this case, it is just sending in something without checking it or assuming that, you know, the opening tag already existed, but so still kind of a straightforward issue. But yeah, I think it really just comes down to the fact that XML one gets parsed a lot. And people try and do it in very performant ways because oftentimes you have giant, massive XML documents. You do get giant JSON documents too, in fairness, but you know, I've seen more, you know, multi-hundred megabyte or even gigabyte XML files than I have JSON files.
Yeah, and you said it's a straightforward issue, and what's kind of interesting here too is I think it would be pretty straightforward to exploit too. Um, Now I am just talking about like what I would assume based on the product and the features that it exposes.
I don't know about the
Um,
grooming you'd really have because this is a file format that you're going to be trying to groom with. The grooming feels like it would be tricky.
yeah, I don't know though. With something like Word or whatever, there is a lot of input potential. So I feel like heap spraying could be relatively straightforward compared to some other types of applications. That is pure speculation on my part though. But yeah, if you can end up doing that heap spraying, um, the control flow hijack is somewhat trivial because the pointer being followed here is for a vtable call. So you would basically get code exec off the bat. But yeah, I mean, pretty straightforward issue and maybe a straightforward exploit, but that's involving speculation on my part. As always with Talos, they don't really go into that, so I just like to have a bit of fun guessing, you know.
Yeah, and I mean it's fair to think like you'd have a lot of potential control. And they do actually call it out. Using heap spreading techniques, an attacker could force the application to allocate memory residing in the appropriate location. I don't know. I mean, I guess part of it is I haven't really looked at exploitation on this sort of document parser. Um, I don't share the same confidence, but they do call it out as something that could be done. They don't say maybe, they do say an attacker could definitely do this. So, I mean, I'll give it to them on that. Yeah.
All right, so up next we have a post from NCC Group that consists of an analysis of a bit of an older boot ROM bug in NXP's high assurance boot functionality, or HAB. There was a vulnerability fixed in 4.3.7, which was a few years ago. I think they say it was fixed in 2017. But there weren't really any details. So they decided to go and analyze it themselves. So yeah, even though this is a bit of an older bug, it's new information and it's an area that's a bit mysterious in nature and often not really publicly documented or anything. So I think it's still interesting in that respect.
Yeah. On the documentation side, it sounds like basically they reached out about, they reported this bug back up to them. Not sure if it was the same thing. And then they finally publicly released information about the advisory that went down in 2017. So, not documented, or at least not publicly documented.
Yeah. And that's kind of where they started out with here, where they talk about this vague wording piques curiosity section. The main section, like part of interest, is the last sentence there, where they say older versions of HAB will run DCD commands, which is basically device config data, which can lead to incorrect authentication boot flow. And the reason for that is this device config data mechanism should be locked off after the boot process exits the ROM. Um, and this device config data is responsible for handling commands for things like initializing the DDR memory controller, image authentication, and some other stuff. Curiously, the signature validation of the device config data and the command sequence file sections are not validated until after it started to execute some stuff. So there's a few commands that can run and get executed before they can be authenticated, such as read, pull, and write commands for the config register spaces. This is pretty damn odd, I would say, as far as I know about like trusted boot and secure boot chains. They speculate it's for support use cases where an image had to be loaded into DDR memory before auth. But yeah, it's kind of an insecure design, which leads to this whole like exploit that they get into.
And adding on to the support aspect, I believe the way they kind of presented as being more if you had like a large file that had, or like a large second stage that needed to be loaded in multiple steps, you would be able to run these things to load it in there, load in extra bits to do your authentication or whatever. Kind of dealing with larger files than what could normally fit into memory, basically, or could fit into the memory available at that stage.
Yeah. On top of that, portions of the command sequence file for loading certificates and super root key or SARK tables are also executed before auth operations. So yeah, there's some pretty sensitive stuff that's going on in that stage. Now the ROM will try to like protect itself a little bit here. It will restrict the memory mapped register ranges that can be used for the device config data commands to those only necessary for the boot time configuration. But it seems the problem, if I'm reading correctly, is the allow list isn't really sufficient because the allow list permits writes to the memory regions that the second stage loader will execute from, even though some of that code was already loaded in the first stage. So because of that, they can basically just rewrite some of the logic to suppress authentication failures and run unsigned code, basically. So if you have write access to non-volatile storage where the device config data and command sequence file are located, you can end up writing over data used in U-boot or the second stage bootloader and suppress authentication failures and whatever else you want to do. They break these down into two separate Vuln sections, one for the device config data and one for the the command sequence file, though they're both essentially just patching the functions used by the second stage loader. Um, in the device config context, they point out an example where you could patch the uboots authenticate image function to always return true, though they state that could be interfered with through the state of the instruction cache. So for pocking, they just patch the command handler table for operations that follow an auth failure, which they would use to hijack control flow and jump somewhere else in memory, or patch do reboot to go into the console. So call oriented type of attacks basically. Similarly, the command sequence file, they abuse the fact that the write data operations were permitted. Now, a write command is typically only available to the ROM context, but with the ability to run unauthenticated code, they could set that back up and give themselves the primitives again. But it basically all stems back to this somewhat flimsy security model of not authenticating the device config file and the command sequence file before executing some code from it, as well as this allow list being a little bit flimsy in terms of um, leaving this hole open for being able to write into data used by the second stage bootloader, um, which can lead to that code being overwritten and stuff. It does of course require fairly high level of access. Being able to write to NV storage is not a common primitive for an attacker to have. You would either need to have physical access or some really high level of privilege, like a tethered root or something, to be able to do it. But I mean, that is within the threat model of trusted boot. It's supposed to be a hardware root of trust, so it's still valid. There is still some impact there, but yeah, you would need a high level of access to pull off this attack, which they state a little bit later on in the
It is a
post. So
high level of access, but as you were just saying there, the threat model of like a hardware root of trust is exactly preventing that sort of attack. Is the fact that you can't even trust that the person with access to the hardware is not an attacker basically. And it's trying to prevent that. That is their goal, is that sort of threat. So like within that context, it's in the wider scope of everything, like the most likely attack to happen, yeah, because of that physical access requirement, like if you're running this on a server or something, it's unlikely somebody gets to that stage very quickly or easily. But in the context of that is the goal of this system, is to prevent that sort of attacks, it does like step up the severity in context of this system and what it is trying to do.
yeah, but yeah, it's a bit of a weird vulnerability and a bit of a weird setup. I do enjoy posts that talk about this kind of stuff though, because it is kind of a specialized area when you're talking about like secure boot, um, and these chains or root of trust type systems. They're pretty different to like the normal software that we cover most of the time on the podcast. So they kind of have like unique challenges and unique attack surfaces that you don't really see in other places. And like I said, in a lot of cases, um, these root of trust systems are not documented, or at least not publicly. They're like NDA'd to hell. So the information you get on them is mostly going to be coming from people who have put in the hard work of reversing it, and trying to figure out how it works. So yeah, it's an interesting area that we don't always get to see stuff about. So whenever bugs come up about it, it is cool to talk about. Even if I don't fully understand that area yet, and I am trying to learn a bit more about it.
it's
But
it's cool to see. At the same time, I did feel like this post was somewhat dense. Part of that just being like their choice of using like the HAB, DCD, CFS, and all of that, like very early on, and just saying, "Don't worry, we'll touch on what these are later."
yeah,
Um,
that did annoy me a little bit too.
yeah, like I had a hard time going through this, especially DCD data. What is it? Data configuration. Um, I have it
uh,
written.
the device config data.
Device config data. That's what it is. Like I almost feel like you could just say like config data or something and not. I mean, yes, DCD is the proper name, but it would be so much more readable if they had a shorthand for it. I don't know. I mean, I had a hard time following this one. And where exactly the issues were, part of that is probably just again on my own fault, not knowing the area very well here. It does remind me of a past, because one of the other times we've talked about like uh this sort of system. It had a very similar case where you had some pre-bootstrapping code that would execute and ultimately ended up being vulnerable. This seems a little bit more blatant in terms of how it's vulnerable and just those configs that you can add in there, but
Yeah,
it
you know what
seems
this
like a
reminds me of a
familiar
little bit?
issue. Say again?
You know what this reminds me of a little bit? I don't remember how long ago we would have covered it. But Intel SGX. SGX had an issue that we covered. I think it was in the form of a paper where they would not protect the page tables as soon as it would boot. Like they would protect it later on, but there was kind of this window where you could go in and patch the page tables from an attacker perspective. Um, this bug kind of reminded me of that a little bit.
That might
Now,
be the one I'm thinking of. Like, it's not exactly the same in any sense, but it's that just that sense the attack surface in the pre-authentication area, I guess.
yeah. Um, But yeah, like it's an interesting area, and I guess tying back to what I was saying about this area of research being difficult and not very accessible, one of the reasons it does really suck to look at is, um, and like it's not like just this blog post or just like NXP here. Basically, all of the vendors who do like secure boot and stuff like that have like an absurd amount of three-letter acronyms that are just never explained or are explained maybe not in public documentation. So you get these acronyms like DCD and SOT, like all these different acronyms, and it's like, okay, I have no idea what I'm reading here. It's like you're reading a different language. Um, so yeah, that's yet another reason piled on top of all the other things that doing
Yeah.
research at this level is so difficult.
In fairness, there's probably a very similar sense of like, when somebody's reading just exploit dev work and seeing, all the different, ROP and friends or whatever else is going on in there. We all have kind of our internal language, I guess.
True. So to end off the podcast, we have a bit of a discussion we thought we'd talk about, which is why care about older vulnerabilities? At the top of this boot ROM topic, I mentioned that this bug was a few years old back in 2017, but there wasn't many details, so they dug into it. And in the past, on the podcast and just in general, it's easy to focus on only what's recent, only caring about like 0 days or recent end days within the last couple months or something like that. So I thought this would be a bit of a cool discussion point because even older vulnerabilities can have some relevant information, as shown in this blog post. Whether that just be like background target information, or maybe for doing like variant analysis or regression testing. But the other point that I wanted to bring up, where I think it could be super valuable, is like as a learning experience, right? I think in specialized kinds of cases like this, where you're hitting the boot chain or just like an attack surface is not well known, it can be a super valuable tool to get your feet wet on a particular target. So, you see like, hey, there was this firmware version or something that patched a bug. Let's go and like patch diff that or try to reverse it and see if we can figure it out and exploit it. And even though it's an older bug, like it can still be very useful to do that. Maybe not for like other people. Maybe it's not going to have a super high impact. And a lot of other people might not care about it. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a good reminder that older vulnerabilities can still have value.
I
Um,
mean, just recently we covered that well, I guess we didn't cover the actual issue, but the PS5 bug with the regression introduced. So an older bug, not quite as old, but still kind of having the regression there. I do think it is important actually to understand at least a bit of the history as to kind of the maturity of the security process in a system as you're looking at it. Seeing kind of how they tackled some of the big issues, especially on older projects, how they introduced security over the years, how they grew to start introducing some of the, maybe newer mitigations or something, or how they approach certain re-architectures. I think you can learn a lot by looking at both what type vulnerabilities were found in the past. Like, maybe they had a run of like one type of vulnerability and then did like a complete re-architecture in order to respond to like not having that sort of vulnerability, or is it always haphazard, patch it as it comes up, but take no sweeping architectural changes. There's a lot that you can kind of see in actually even just looking at the reports over the years, not even necessarily digging into all the details. Sometimes you need to go into all the details, of course, too. Sometimes you just don't have that information out of the titles, I guess, or like CV titles aren't always going to be very descriptive. or CV summaries, I guess. So yeah, I do think understanding the history is a good thing that comes from just looking at the past vulnerabilities. And when it comes to just kind of your own learning about exploit development, this is maybe going a bit off from the discussion you want to have, but one of the things that annoys me a lot is when somebody looks at some older resource that's absolutely solid, good information. Is like, well, this is from, maybe, 2007, take hacking art of exploitation. I think second edition is like '07 or '08 or something. I'm like, well, why should I care about this anymore? Because it's so old. And similar with like old exploits, old resources, there's just a ton of value in understanding where we came from, because it's generally not the case that um exploit development just changes entirely. Instead, it's been like a series of steps. You have one technique, you have one strategy, and then, they patch something, fix something, and you build off of that old one. The old one's still there, we're still overflowing buffers or whatever. It's just your techniques afterwards change. Similar in looking at old exploits on any target that you want to actually look at. Just seeing kind of that progress, what you need to build off. You can see a lot, I guess, out of the history and how exploits were built up. That I don't know if that quite makes sense. I started rambling there, but
Well, I mean, I think it's just easy to get caught up in the idea that exploit dev moves quickly, and you feel like you're wasting time if you're looking at older exploit strategies or whatever that are not necessarily relevant for the cutting edge targets anymore. Um, Meanwhile, yeah, that's the other thing too. It kind of depends on what target you're looking at. Like if you're in like the IoT space, then attacks from 1990s are probably going to be relevant for you still, because there's not really a whole lot of mitigation over there. But if you're attacking like a browser or something, then it's going to be very different. There's going to be a lot more modern mitigations. Um, and yeah, I mean, maybe when you're talking about 10 or 20 years ago, it does start to become like, vulns from that time are probably not super useful to look at. I mean, there's a lot of vulnerability classes from like the early 2000s that aren't relevant at all anymore. Like, let's say null dereference is kind of like a perfect one to point to. But if you're talking within
except
like the
on
last,
IoT.
except maybe on IoT,
I
yeah.
mean, there are cases, yeah, like no dereference probably a good shout that operating systems have been able to largely help take care of. Um, that said, I still think there's value in looking back, even going 10 plus years at some exploits. Like, do you have to do it? No. Like if you're looking to get started on a project, if you're sorry, on a new target, you're just getting started on something. Do you have to go look 10 years back? No. Is there some value in even looking back there though? I think there can be, especially for overlooked vulnerabilities. Something we've kind of talked about a lot on more of the bounty side of like overlooked research. You can kind of have some certain overlooked areas or issues that maybe weren't completely patched, that happened years ago, old code that we'll just kind of assume is solid and, maybe look for uh fresher targets. But I mean, if I were looking on like a new target, I would only be looking, a few years back, maybe up to like 5 years back personally. But that doesn't mean going further back be useful, I guess. But I guess that comes down to, well, what's the trade off over spending all the time learning that for some that's maybe completely irrelevant, though. As a researcher, you can definitely you can filter some of that too, like the null refs or whatever.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, like as a learning experience, I think it can be useful, especially like if you're looking at the near past, I guess. So like yeah, last 5 years I would say is a good window. And in specialized cases like this, like circling back to this boot ROM topic for a second, this kind of situation I feel like is perfect for like if you were trying to um get your feet wet on a target, learn about it, but like have to put in, the effort and get comfortable with the exploit environment. Because yeah, like in this case, there was some detail that could point you in the right direction. It was talking about like being able to subvert the boot flow with like with these different files on the non-volatile storage, but it doesn't really call out specifics. You would need to do some reversing and root causing to figure out what exactly you can do, what kind of attack strategies are available to you. Um, it probably involved a lot of frustration, but you would also force yourself to learn like what works, what doesn't work, and stuff like that on a target is something that's a lot easier to get by just trying things than it is by like just trying to read everything. Like I know there is like the grok idea, which some people interpret as like read every book on this target and read all the documentation or whatever. Like, but when you're attacking something, it's often a lot more useful to just try things, see what happens, and document it. Um, which is kind of like what they were doing here. So yeah, I
We'll
mean,
give you like
especially in a case like this, I think an older vulnerability is very useful.
even looking at older vulns, like it will give you an understanding of, say, again, kind of tying this more in towards the software stuff than this particular boot ROM, but like of common structures that might be attacked. Yeah, sure, over the years those change, things are added, moved around and stuff. But oftentimes, like you're going to see the same big concepts existing across those structures across the years. There's a lot of exposure you get that's easier to gain when you're looking at the simpler, older system. In general, they only get more complex as time goes rather than simpler as time goes on. So have starting off with something simpler is a valid strategy to get that initial knowledge that you can then transfer to the more recent system. Especially when we're talking about something that you're going to be looking at for several months at a time. This isn't as valid of a thing when you're maybe only going to be spending 2 weeks, like as a consultant or something.
Yeah, we've talked about this concept before quite a bit, especially in the discussion videos, maybe not so much on the podcast, but um, the idea of primitives with exploit dev. Like, if you look back even like 10 or 20 years, the primitives have not changed in memory corruption. You're still going for the same types of primitives, going for like a read or a write primitive or a code exec primitive or whatever. Like, all of that stuff hasn't changed at all. It's mainly just like how you get to those primitives might be a bit tougher and you might have to do some more tricks. But like the
The
core
fact that we call
concepts.
them primitives has changed. That is one of the things that has definitely changed. It's even just terminology. Like, I
That's
mean,
true.
that's maybe not a discussion we want to take on right now, but like primitives are like the big paradigm shift, I think, the last 10 years. Prior, like 10 years ago, talking about exploitation, you maybe had an overflow. You still had some of those same vulnerabilities, overflowing out of bounds access, use after free, type confusion, whatever. Still had those, but it was often like one step, just you're using raw. So you had a raw based exploit or whatever. It wasn't as much of having the primitives to slow or primitive chaining to actually build something up. Um, we've almost it's almost formalized a little bit, having a more formal way of understanding because it is something that even back then, like you had this intuitive understanding of what you're doing, but didn't really have that same, or at least it wasn't quite adopted yet, that same language of primitives and all of that. Like that's kind of the big paradigm shift. But I'd also say that's probably heading a little bit off topic here.
Yeah, it's been formalized, but yeah, my main point there was just like the core ideas are still the same. So the types of things that you can do and want to do just haven't really changed that much, even though it seems like the like exploit dev has moved a lot in 20 years, which it has in some respects, but the core ideas are still the same. So yeah. Um,
Yeah, actually, exploit development has moved very fast, but like I said, there's these foundational concepts that like how computers work is ultimately what we're taking advantage of. And that hasn't changed all that much. That's kind of one of the things that frustrates me when people are trying to learn and they're worried about these resources being too old. And there are aspects that are very, very dated. We did that discussion video about hacking art of exploitation and kind of just old resources in general. But on the
yeah, I
topic
think
of
it was
just
called
how,
Our Old Books Worth It for
yeah,
anyone who's
something
interested
like
in that
that.
discussion.
Um, but that whole idea of exploit development just moves really quickly. It does. I like there's the bleeding edge, but almost everything exists or like before that isn't on the bleeding edge of implementing new mitigations or anything like that. It's just standard exploit development, and it hasn't really changed all that much there, or it changes a lot slower, I guess.
Yeah. Um, But yeah, I just thought we'd talk about it a little bit because it is something we've kind of glossed over, especially on the podcast. But there's definitely value there, and yeah, I thought it'd be a bit of an interesting discussion point. Um, but yeah, unless you have anything to add, Z, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I know it's been a little bit of a shorter show, but we were a bit limited on topics for the
Yeah,
last week or so.
just two real Vulns this week plus spot the Vuln. I mean, it was a tough week for topics. Honestly, I was looking for stuff this week and um not find like there were some other Vuln write-ups, but not finding a lot that had something interesting about them. So yeah,
Yeah.
no, I don't have any shout outs.
All right, cool. So that's everything that we have for this episode. As always, thanks to everyone who tuned in. VOD will be up on YouTube and other platforms tomorrow. Summaries will be up on our site at day0sec.com. Remember to follow our Twitter and join our Discord if you want to see notifications of when we go live or whenever any other content drops. And yeah, with all that said, we'll see you all next week.